Hey, boss, what are you doing?
Oh, God. I told you kobolds to stay out of my private space when I'm working. If you must know, the landlord raised our rent, and the YouTube money isn't gonna cut it. So to keep a roof over our heads, I've been forced to start selling merchandise with pictures of my naked body on it. Weirdos on the internet go crazy for that shit.
But, boss, you don't wear clothes.
Okay, yeah, so?
Isn't every picture of you a naked picture?
Aw, fuck. Well, if you're so smart, why don't you think of something?
Why don't you just make a Patreon? That's what most YouTube personalities are doing these days.
That's not a bad idea. But what am I gonna do with all these calendars that I ordered?
Maybe I could...
No, you can't have them.
Aw, man.
Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Den of the Drake. Other dragons hoard gold, while I hoard internet cringe. As a red-blooded American, I find it odd that there are so many neckbeards that choose to become obsessed with Japanese culture of all things. Don't they know that America is the only country in the world and every other country is just a lie perpetuated by the liberal media? Over-the-top patriotism aside, the internet is filled with these odd creatures that have been scientifically dubbed weeaboos. See, long ago, a magical land called Japan was home to noble warriors and royal palaces. But then around circa 1945, a great cataclysm bathed the country in nuclear fire, and from the ashes an evil blight emerged: anime. This curse began to corrupt the youth of other nations and turn them to the path of darkness and fedoras. Of course, nobody knows how this cataclysm happened. All we know is that... Oh my God. America caused weeaboos? I'm gonna need a moment to process this. In the meantime, today's story stars a neckbeard, whose hatred of religion and love of anime is enough for the patience of his D&D group to snap like a twig. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right into the horrifying world of r/RPG-Horror-Stories. Enjoy. This story is titled, My Experience with the Chosen King of Neckbeards. Warning, really damned long. Like sweet Lord in heaven, this thing is long. So I had joined a D&D group in my local area. I was the youngest, being 14 at the time, but my dad had raised me with RPGs, and I had already played and DM'd a few campaigns. But this would be the first outside of friends and family. But regardless, I was fairly mature for my age, and can hold a decent conversation, so I felt confident that it wouldn't be awkward. After all, I had been in similar situations before. So we all get together and write up our characters. I chose the group, since all the people involved like Warhammer, which I was a massive fan of. And being the Warhammer nerds that we were, we all had very grim-dark characters. Another important note is that all cosmetic changes were allowed on our part, as long as they made sense within the rules. I liked pretty much all of the characters. They all appealed to my teenage edge. The characters included a dwarven barbarian, who planned to multiclass into a paladin, a drow rogue, a humanish, definitely not chaos worshipper warlock, and me as a dragonborn cleric, biblical revelation style, who spat boiling blood. And finally, the fighter, the elven fighter. All of the players were really nice. The DM was a great storyteller, and we really got into role-playing, especially the fighter. You see, the fighter was played by a foul-smelling fellow, who would always wear the same anime t-shirt. But I'd be damned if he didn't hang his trench coat and fedora by the door on the way in, because Jesus Christ, things got ugly with him. For starters, his character was a total self-insert, basically being a taller, more attractive version of himself. But he always insisted on fighting with a katana. despite the DM constantly reminding him that they were in a northern medieval setting. And I mean medieval, with streets of mud and the plague patrol going down every other day. But he gave excuses like, people would surely buy such unique and high-quality blades brought in by wandering merchants. The DM didn't want katanas in his campaign, but eventually caved and sold it to him for double the price of a usual sword. The barbarian, in his usual friendly rivalry kind of way, tried to mock him for having such a thin sword. These would usually go something like this. Barbarian: can't handle a real sword, can ya, you pointy-eared ferryman? Fighter: you can't handle a real weapon, you savage. This weapon takes skill, precision, discipline, and years of training, the likes of which you couldn't even handle. You instead choose to wildly hack away, like some uncivilized brute, and insult those who use more precise weapons, simply because you're scared of them. As opposed to what actually happened with other characters, which would usually go like this. Barbarian: too scared to use a real weapon to kill your enemies, you walking sack of potatoes. Warlock: you only say that because if you attack from afar, you'd only be able to hit their shoes. Barbarian: oh, by my granddad's glorious white beard, it is on. Warlock: whoever kills the most marauders wins the other one's rations. Barbarian: may the best man win, or whatever you are win. But that's not all. The fighter would also go on long, drawn-out monologues every time something important in the plot happened, usually in some attempt to make it all about him, which segues into the next issue. He wanted to be the Mary Sue of the world, and during the later parts when the DM wasn't giving it to him, he tried to be the backseat DM who would always try to influence the world for their player. Not only that, but he wanted to be perfect, beautiful, and infallible, as opposed to our ragtag gang of morally questionable individuals, who you would not want to encounter on the street at night. But he just had to always be in the right, so quick to condemn us of being not worthy to represent the light, despite the only one of us trying to do so happened to be a lunatic from the desert who thought the light would turn the seas to blood. The power fantasy element in many modern video games has done a huge disservice for TTRPGs. Now, I know that comparing Skyrim to D&D is beating a dead horse, but I'm gonna do it anyway. In Skyrim, the Dragonborn is designed to be an all-powerful blank slate, someone easy for the player to impress themselves on. They're not designed to have any sort of goals or ambitions or any kind of flaw, because the developers wanted to give the illusion of choice to their players. There's only one common characteristic that everyone's Dragonborn will always have in common. They always come out on top. Everyone's Dragonborn defeats Alduin, everyone's Dragonborn gets accepted into the Thieves Guild, even if they fail the initiation, and everyone's Dragonborn gets to deliver the final one-liner in every dialogue tree. And don't get me started on how the world worships you for being Dragonborn. Well, except for Nazim, but even then, one Fusroda later and that problem is solved. Games like Skyrim are designed to make the player feel powerful, not to help them learn how to make interesting characters. Let's face it, if you strip away all of the outside backstory and roleplay elements that players add to their individual Dragonborns, and only look at them and how they interact with the world of Skyrim, all of a sudden, everyone's Dragonborn ends up being really fucking boring. You end up getting characters like our elven fighter here, when players try to take that same power fantasy idea into D&D. With these kinds of players, the party could go shopping for something mundane like vegetables, and it will devolve into pseudo-philosophical ramblings with two players going back and forth trying to beat each other for the final one-liner. Interesting characters always have flaws, so rejoice next time you roll up a character and they have the same stats as a paraplegic sloth. You have the opportunity to make a memorable character that your party will love, before they die horribly 2 sessions later. One more weird thing was that he would always have his character try to hit on the rogue. Both her character and player were visibly uncomfortable. Of course, he never admitted it since he wanted his character to have his own harem. But things started getting really bad when the stakes started to raise and a true quest became apparent, and the campaign came into its own. He started butting heads with pretty much everyone else involved, but I seemed to bear the brunt of it. As both the characters and players were in stark contrast, my character had garnered a reputation as a herald of Armageddon, the messenger of a vengeful god who both warns of his coming wrath and smites the sinners who stand against it. However, of course, the fighter, King of Neckbeards, couldn't stand religion. He went on various monologues about how there are no gods in this uncaring world, and religion is for brain-dead cultists who want to start another Spanish Inquisition, which annoyed me a fair bit because I was, and am, a fairly steadfast Catholic. Catholics don't really regard Revelation as valid, for a number of reasons, which is why I felt able to make a character based around it. But I tried only to argue in character, giving off loose biblical verses and things like that. Seriously, that shit is my jam. Me and the rest of the group were leaning towards an ending like Revelation, where divine fury is cast onto the world and suddenly vengeful armies of the gods and those humans still loyal face off against those tempted by devils and their false miracles as all hell breaks loose. But Neckbeard had other plans. He wanted to effortlessly save the world and become the king of everything ever, because he's just that good. Oh, and we would get to be like middle class or something. But the DM didn't like that, so he tended to lean more towards the biblical route. Keep in mind that this only really kicked into gear around a quarter into the campaign. We started facing more biblical enemies, and the plot began advancing in that direction. Around halfway through, we started getting more involved with the gods. The barbarian, who at this stage was equal parts barbarian and paladin, and was some sort of badass avatar of war, became a chosen warrior of various gods of war, fire, and metal. The warlock became the champion of the dark gods, gaining forbidden powers and eldritch secrets in return. The rogue began to develop plans involving elven gods, and it was all coming together. A mix of grim dark fantasy and revelation biblical stories. The stage was well on the way to being set. But the Neckbeard, despite being offered multiple chances to become a champion of some form of divinity, refused, because he feared no gods. Eventually he became fed up with having to not be the best at everything, and having the campaign not go his way, and he became an increasingly lone wolf, and just generally upped the cringy anime protagonist thing. After multiple hissy fits at the table, he decided to challenge me to a duel. Now, you see, my character would have definitely jumped at the chance to put that arrogant shit in his place and show him the power of a god, so I accepted. Despite the inherent unfairness of a cleric versus fighter duel, he still acted as if he were somehow honorable. But between me choosing the war domain and being the chosen prophet of the dice gods, I somehow won the fight, and I made a show of it. The blood of saints seeded his skin, and holy flames scorched his bones, as the wrath of the gods manifested and rained down from the heavens. an overwhelming victory on my part. As I billowed about how he should know his place against the gods, he started saying that it wasn't fair, and that I cheated by getting my god involved, and that I wasn't honorable. Other characters remarked on how a fighter going against a cleric who can't even use his divine powers wasn't exactly honorable, but he just had none of it, and demanded that I heal his wounds and fight him fairly. Mind you, he is laying on the ground bleeding severely. I told him that I am an avatar of my god, and his and my actions are one and the same, and as such the use of him was all well and good. I told him that I would not rematch him, and then I healed his wounds. But oh no. Oh Lord no, he wasn't having any of that. He immediately tried to rush me while I had my back to him, and I had just healed him. This was the guy who complained about honor. The barbarian and the warlock stepped in, saying that this wasn't a duel anymore, but he just told them to get out of my way or I'll show you my wrath as well. They proceeded to beat the shit out of him. He then chucked a tantrum about how it's just not fair, and this is where it gets real juicy. He started yelling about how he was targeted because he was the smartest, and because he had the best character, and we were all just jealous. And apparently we all just didn't appreciate it because we had unsophisticated Western taste. Keep in mind, he was the whitest one out of all of us. He literally threw a book at me and yelled about how I'm ruining the world with my bigoted Western views and abhorrent religion. And I was genuinely terrified. For one, the book hurt like hell. And two, he was a 30-year-old man and I was some bone-thin 14-year-old. I mean, I did look older than I was, but I was still bloody shaking. He then proceeded to storm out of the house. We continued the session, but it was awkward and I left feeling pretty scared. He might have been a neckbeard at heart, but he was actually pretty physically imposing and I was still shaken. Okay, so here's something that comes up way more often in horror stories than it should. Physical violence at the game table. Look, I can't believe that there are actually people in this world that would resort to throwing books because their fictional elf isn't as badass as they thought they would be. Look, I get it. D&D doesn't always attract the most socially well-adjusted people. But for fuck's sake, that is inexcusable. For those who think that they may have a hard time dealing with a situation like this, I have a patented one-step plan for you to follow. Step 1. Tell them to fucking leave and never come back. If they refuse, call the police and have them escorted off your property. That's it. That's the whole plan. Violence at a D&D table is inexcusable. I am not your mom. And if you start throwing tantrums like a child and physically harming people, the only discipline you're gonna get from me is at the end of a police taser. Next session, he shows up, despite being kicked from the group chat. He walks over to the table like nothing happened. But then the barbarian says, "We don't want you here. You scared the bloody hell out of the boy. He's still got bruises all over his face. He's only a kid, for Christ's sake." To which the neckbeard replied, "He deserved it, and he'll get more if you don't let me play." At which point I was getting scared and was spring-loaded to bolt to the other side of the house. But then the DM said, "Leave the kid alone and get the bloody hell out of my house before I call the police." The neckbeard must have thought that he was tough for scaring someone half his age, because he thought that he could try and intimidate the DM. The warlock called the police while the barbarian got pictures of his car. By the time he realized what had happened, the neckbeard bolted to his car and drove off, where the police found him on the road. Apparently, he had already been in trouble for trying to bully children into giving him things. Rare cards and collector's items and whatnot. And after that, we never saw him again. The campaign continued on and was really fun from there. The rogue's new boyfriend joined in and he was really cool. He filled the role that the neckbeard left, but with much less anime. And the campaign eventually came to a climactic end that just couldn't have been better. End of story. Ah yes, the marks of a noble warrior. Entitled opinions, hatred towards others' religious beliefs, and repeat offenses of bullying children. Of course, it goes without saying that OP and crew did the right thing, and we got ourselves a happy ending because of it. Of course, it's probably not a very happy ending for Neckbeard, because I find it hard to believe that any judge will be sympathetic with his "they were picking on me because I'm too smart" story. Now, before we go, let's take a look at this week's Gallery of the Drake. This week's fan art is done by viewer Kanakomi and depicts me in a moment of solemn reflection. Look at him, so majestic, so wise. Years of hoarding cringe wearing on his fragile soul. What could he possibly be thinking about? When I used to play Pokemon Go, I always felt weird about trading Pokemon for candy that ended up being the exact same color as the Pokemon I traded in. It's either a total coincidence, or they're throwing these poor creatures in a blender and then feeding their artificially sweetened remains to other Pokemon. It's kinda fucked up when you really think about it. Thank you again, Kanakomi, for sending in your art. If you want to see your fan art featured in Gallery of the Drake, be sure to send it to the email in my About section. Fan art is one of my favorite parts of doing YouTube, and it means the world to me that I can create content that inspires artists like you to create artwork like this. With the story over and artwork displayed, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up. If you want to support the channel in a more personal way, feel free to go check out my Patreon and merch store. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time in the Den of the Drake.